Hello. This is one of two videos that I'll record for today to replace today's class. You should have already watched the cartoon about Giordano Bruno, which is you'll find just above this video on the website. The question I want to start with before we get into Bruno's text and talking more deeply about him, I want to ask you to consider for a moment why we might want to read a figure like Giordano Bruno. Bruno was not a scientist. He didn't contribute anything major to science, although he contributed a great many ideas that would influence science later. He's he's known for many reasons. One reason he is known is as a reader and interpreter of Copernicus. So when we read Copernicus, when we read that text, you and I found a text that is more or less a fairly complicated text in the history of astronomy. It was a text in the genre of astronomical treatises, right? And we learned many things while reading that text, of course. We learned that Copernicus' idea is to place the sun at the center of the universe, and that the main idea he had was of the motion of the Earth and not the changing of the place of the Earth and the sun. We saw that he gives various kinds of arguments for his new position, some of which sound like good arguments to us, having to do with the simplicity, order, beauty, design of his particular system over and against the Ptolemaic system. Those questions of simplicity, elegance, economy are still the kinds of arguments that are used in modern science. But we also see he used all kinds of other arguments drawn from Aristotle, Aristotelian philosophy. Certain religious ideas were very important to him. And he did have a general underlying philosophical view, although it wasn't always obvious or always important to what he was saying. Among those philosophical ideas, we saw he has a certain idea about the perfection of circles. We also saw that a certain Christian outlook was very important to his ideas. And they actually freed him up in a certain way because unlike Aristotle or Ptolemy, who believed that the universe was essentially eternal, Copernicus could ask himself, what kind of a universe would an intelligent, perhaps a lover of geometry, who was a god, what kind of universe would they create? And that's the universe he looked for and believed in. And of course, that only made sense because he as a Christian, he believes in the creation of the universe. Now, Bruno. So, despite all of that, when we read Copernicus's text, we didn't find him making any bold claims. We never saw him talking about what significance his new system of the universe might have for human beings. We saw that a certain view motivated it, but we didn't see what kind of impact he thought it might have. And that really didn't interest him, I don't believe. He was a serious scientist, astronomer. It was for others later, and some of his contemporaries, to read his text and to try to interpret and try to figure out what does it mean for us as human beings. Now that's very interesting to us. And that is why we read Giordano Bruno in particular, to see what humanistic significance, what does it mean for us as human beings, this Copernican revolution of sorts. Another reason to as you'll see when we get through this text and get into it, a reason to read these kinds of texts is because we still interpret Copernicus as having a certain humanistic significance for ourselves. And that is often very different from what he saw and thought, and also from what others in his period saw and thought. So for instance, let me give two examples of this. When you and I learn about the Copernican revolution in school or whatever, we often learn about it as the claim that the Earth is no longer in the center of the universe, and so is no longer in a special place, is no longer in the central, most important, best place in the universe. However, you and I saw when we were going through the text and talking about Aristotle that is not a view that Copernicus had or Aristotle had. Namely, they did not have the idea that the center of the universe was a perfect, better, privileged place. Quite the opposite. They had the idea that the center of the universe was the more imperfect, corrupted, changing, indeed lower part of the universe. It's where all the heavy materials flow to, and it is less like God than the heavens, which are more changeless, eternal, perfect, and so on. So the significance that significance of the Copernican revolution of putting the human being outside of a privileged place, which we now tend to attribute to it, is not something that the contemporaries of Copernicus would have understood even. Another example of that is that you and I, when we think about the universe, it's very easy, particularly in the modern period, you can find a lot of authors who think this way. They see the removal of the Earth from the center of the universe as something that undermines the value of humanity and places us into this kind of infinitely large world where we're just this tiny speck, meaningless, purposeless existence in this, on this ball of dirt, hurling through the universe, right? And that is a very depressing kind of picture. I'm sure you're very familiar with it, but that again, as we read through Giordano Bruno, ask yourself whether that is the picture that he derives from the Copernican revolution. And as you'll see, he doesn't get a depressing picture whatsoever. He gets the very opposite. He feels himself freed and elevated and become closer to God through the Copernican revolution. So we'll talk about how this is possible. Now, on the screen here, you'll see some photographs, just some things about Giordano Bruno. Recall that Copernicus's book was published in 1543. So Bruno is quite a bit younger. He was not born until 5 years after the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres was published, 5 years after Copernicus's death. And he lived until 1600, when he was, in fact, put to death by the Catholic Church. He was not put to death simply for being a Copernican, although that was part of it. He was kind of the kind of person you might know, a person like this, who cannot suffer having an authority over him. And so whenever he felt there was an authority in his presence, he would find a way to undermine that authority, to irritate that authority, and so on. Right? Many people have problems with authority. Bruno is probably the master of them all. He was a priest. Well, I'll read this little passage here. But here you can see, let me say a little bit about this picture. If you go to Rome, and I hope someday you do if you haven't already, and you can go and see this statue of in the Campo dei Fiori. This is exactly the place where Bruno was burned by the Catholic Church. It's a very impressive statue. You cannot see his face. It's kind of darkened there. We do not actually know what Bruno looked like, except that he was perhaps a small Italian man of dark features. The reason the statue is there, quite interestingly, is that it's a kind of symbol, a monument that was built in the name of free thinking, in the name of independence, particularly from the church. And when they were originally going to build this statue, the idea was that they were going to have Bruno with his back turned so that his back is towards the Vatican in Rome. Of course, the Vatican didn't like that very much, so they weren't able to go through with that. Nevertheless, still to this day, every year at the time when Bruno was burned, people gather around this in a celebration. Italians celebrate freedom of thought and independent thinking and so on. And many people give speeches around this monument. Here's again, we don't know what Bruno looked like, but here's the kind of likeness that some people have imagined. Here, these are the set of famous doors in Rome. You see there's a relief of the trial of Giordano Bruno by the Roman Inquisition, right? Oh, this is actually in the Campo dei Fiori. You can see Bruno there being at the Inquisition. If you don't, you probably know something about the Inquisition. There were many trials held by the Catholic Church of people who were reportedly unorthodox or had heretical views. Bruno was among them. There's another depiction. There is a crater named after Giordano Bruno on the moon as well, which you might see. This is Pope Clement VIII, who was the pope at the time of Bruno's execution. They actually, Bruno was in prison for about a decade, and when he was finally put to death, one of the stories is that the reason they put him to death in 1600 was as part of a kind of celebration and warning against certain people who took the ideas of Bruno and others related to him too far. This is Cardinal Richard Bellarmine, who, as you can see here, resided over the trials of both Bruno and Galileo. Galileo was condemned quite a bit later, and he was not put to death, of course. Okay, those are the pictures. So let's see what it says here. It says, in 1548, at a stormy period in the history of Italy, so Bruno was Italian, Bruno was born in the town of Nola. You'll see that is significant because he always identified himself with this town of Nola, which is right near Naples. You can drive through. So he often refers to himself as the Nolan, if you were wondering what that was in the text. At the time, when he was born, it was under Spanish rule. In fact, Italy, as it now exists as one unified country, did not come into being until the 1860s. So several hundred years after Bruno was born. His father was a soldier, probably of a good family. He had a son. Nothing too interesting there. Now, this at the bottom, this is worth reading a little bit, because this is actually the actual report, the description by priests of the execution of Bruno. So it says, at the second hour of the night, it was intimated to the company that the impenitent, meaning Bruno, the one who would not recant his heresies, was to be executed in the morning. So at the 6th hour, the comforters and the chaplain met at St. Ursula and went to the prison of the Tower of Nona. After the customary prayers in the chapel, there was consigned to them the undermentioned condemned to death. That is, Giordano, son of the late Giovanni Bruno, an apostle friar of Nola in the kingdom, an impenitent heretic, an apostate friar. He was, in fact, a monk. He grew up a monk. So when he was in adolescence, he became a monk. He grew up in the Catholic Church. Then he was eventually kicked out of his particular group of monks there around Nola, supposedly because he held beliefs that sounded too much like Protestants. With all clarity, our brethren exhorted him to repent, that is, to take back what he had said. And there were called 2 fathers of St. Dominic, 2 of the Society of Jesus, 2 of the New Church, and 1 of St. Jerome, who, with all affection and much learning, showed him his error. But he remained to the end in his accursed obstinacy, his brain and intellect seething with 1,000 errors and vanities. So, persevering in his obstinacy, he was led by the servants of justice to the Campo dei Fiori, there stripped, bound to a stake, and burnt alive. Attended always by our company chanting the litanies, the comforters exhorting him up to the last point to abandon his obstinacy, but in the end, finally, he ended his life miserably, his miserable, unhappy life. According to another report, he wouldn't be quiet, so they drove a stake through his tongue to make him be silent before they burned him. You can go to this Wikipedia page and read more about him if you're interested. But now I want to turn to the actual text in our reader, now that we know something about Bruno. He's a very interesting fellow. Fun to read. He is incredibly arrogant, which is kind of amusing, as you'll see. So here, this picture is a picture of the crowd of philosophers. He despises all, just about anyone who thinks of themselves as wise, important, authoritative. This is him referring to the crowd of philosophers as it were idiots. This is from a book called Ash Wednesday Supper, which is a dialogue. He wrote it. In fact, one of the things that Bruno did in his life is he traveled. So once he was kicked out of his monastery, he traveled around Europe looking for people to host him and trying to get academic positions and trying to stay away from the Catholic Church, essentially. One of the trips he made was to London, where he met a bunch of people, English intellectuals, and he gave them a lecture on the Copernican philosophy, and they did not like him. They found him to be a very humorous fellow, and they made fun of him, and he was very upset by this and thought of them, they were all idiots. And so he returned to Italy to write this dialogue in which he kind of lampoons and makes fun of the British, and also talks about his theories about Copernicus. So here, let me read a little bit. So Smith, you might see this is an Englishman he's referring to, right? Gives him the name Smith. Whereas Bruno's voice is taken by this fellow Teofilo, right? Loved by God, or the philosopher. And here is what he says about Copernicus. He says, he was a man of deep and developed, diligent and mature genius, a man not second to any astronomer before him, except in the order and succession and time. A man who, in regard to innate intellect, was greatly superior to Ptolemy, Hipparchus, Exodus, Eudoxus, and all others who followed in their footsteps. This estate he attained by freeing himself from a number of false presuppositions of the common and vulgar philosophy, which I do not go so far as to term blindness. Yet Copernicus did not go much further, because, being more a student of mathematics than nature, he could not plumb and probe into the matters to the extent that he could completely uproot the unsuitable and empty principles. So here we see a kind of mixed or measured estimation of Copernicus. He sees Copernicus as greater than all the other previous astronomers and is opening up a new way, but he criticizes Copernicus because Copernicus stuck to mathematics. He didn't give a natural philosophy to support it, and he didn't interpret the significance of his revolution. He stuck to the narrow confines of astronomical observation, calculation, and so on. Right. So he sees Copernicus as a figure who opens up a new way, a genius to be praised, but at the same time not to be overestimated because he stuck to mathematics. A little below here, he says, in spite of this, who will ever be able to praise sufficiently the greatness of the German? Now, Copernicus was not German, but Bruno doesn't know that. Having little regard to the stupid mob, stood so firmly against the torrent of beliefs, and although almost destitute of vital reasons, took up again those despised and rusty fragments that he was able to get from the hands of antiquity, refurbished them, meaning he cleaned them up again, and assembled and fastened them together again with the mathematical more than natural reasoning. Again, emphasizing mathematical reasoning as the kind of reasoning that Copernicus used, not natural reasoning, which would have been better, right? So he sees Copernicus just as Copernicus himself saw himself, returning back to the ideas of antiquity, of the ancients, and refurbishing them. As he continues, in this way he brought the cause, which had been ridiculed, despised, and vilified, to be honored, praised, to be more credible than its opposite, and most certainly more serviceable and expeditious for theoretical and calculative purposes. when you look through this text, this is one of those texts that's very poetic in a lot of ways. So it's sometimes helpful to just circle or underline certain phrases that seem typical. Like when he talks about Copernicus, it's always about standing firm, avowing openly, being bold, putting down and not listening to the mob, the rude, right? Rude and discourteous, the ignorant. This is the opponent of Bruno, right? And whereas Bruno is all for boldness and freedom and standing firm and so on. Here again, he continues about Copernicus. He was ordained by the gods to be the dawn which must precede the rising of the sun of the ancient and true philosophy. For so many centuries entombed in the dark caverns of blind, spiteful, arrogant, and envious ignorance. He sees, so again, this is the kind of language he sees his opponents, the Aristotelians, the church. They're blind, they're spiteful, they're arrogant, they're envious, they're petty, they're stupid. By contrast, Copernicus was ordained by the gods to be the dawn, and this is a very nice picture, the dawn which must precede the rising of the sun. So that's the sun coming up. Copernicus is the dawn that precedes the rising of the sun. So something's coming after Copernicus. Copernicus is the dawn, but what is the sun? We're going to see that's Bruno himself, right? But the sun of the ancient and true philosophy, right? So what's coming up new is a return to the ancient and true philosophy, right? Again, more language like this. Raise oneself, stand erect, stand up, and be faithfully guided by the eye of divine intelligence. So he sees his position as one that he would be led to by God, right? Not just scientific reasoning. He sees this as a divine realization, the Copernican revolution. And now he turns to talking about the Nolan. And now what shall I say of the Nolan, right? As if you were listening a little earlier, the Nolan, who is the Nolan? It's Bruno, of course. So it's a little bit strange. Bruno speaks of himself in the third person, and the next couple of passages here are him trying to explain how it is appropriate, because he is so great, it is appropriate for him to praise himself, right? But he starts off by saying, perhaps it is not appropriate for me to praise him, since he is as close to me as I am to myself. Yes, of course he is, because they are one and the same person. But then he goes on to say, well, is it wrong to praise things that are great just because they are close to one? And his answer is no. The next set of passages here, this is, as I marked, it's a very key set of passages. So Bruno sees his role as taking what Copernicus began and finishing it in a kind of grand way. Copernicus moved the Earth out into the planets, and Bruno is going to go all the way to the idea of an infinite universe in which the sun itself is just another star. Right? Remember, Copernicus believed that the sun was the center of the universe. He never proposed that the sun was more or less the same thing as a star. Bruno, for whatever reason, how he got this idea is of course a bit astonishing. He didn't have any empirical reason to believe this. He just, once the change in thinking occurred such that the old system had broken down, he, in his kind of boldness, tried to embrace the most extreme form of what you could call the Copernican revolution, right? Take it as far as possible. And this included for him, ultimately the idea of an infinite universe, right? And of, as I said, of the idea not only that our sun is another star, but that those stars are all other suns, meaning they have planets around them, and maybe those planets are inhabited, and so on. So he sees himself breaking through to this new, in his mind at least, flying out into this new universe and recognizing its great, being one of the first human beings to recognize it for the immensity that it is. And so one of his images here is of exploration. With his mind, he will pass out of the medieval tiny sphere of stars and fly into the universe itself. And so he appropriately then compares himself to other historical explorers. So we see here the first is one you've never heard of, certainly, which is the ancient Tiphys, right? He says, so the way he puts this rhetorically is, if they are great explorers, then how great then must be the Nolan? Because they only explored earthly things, where he's exploring the entire universe, right? And then he goes on to see what the result of theirs. He's a greater explorer because the result of his explorations are quite a bit better, infinitely better than the results of theirs. So he says, if the ancient Tiphys is praised for having invented the first ship and crossed the sea with the Argonauts, if in our own times Christopher Columbus, is glorified as the one of whom it was foretold long ago, time will come when the ocean will open all the barriers of the world and so on, then how shall we honor this man, the Nolan, who has found the way to ascend to the sky, compass the circumference of the stars, and leave at his back the convex surface of the firmament? What is that convex surface of the firmament? It is, if you go to this is exactly what this picture is based on. Here, let me drag it over real quick. This picture in the background, right? Passing through, leaving behind him the sphere of the firmament. The firmament is the fixed stars, right? Passing beyond. This is Bruno passing beyond. So he says, if Columbus is great for having discovered the New World and opened up a new world to us, and if the first shipbuilder is praised for having opened up the seas, then what should we think of the Nolan, who has opened up the universe, right? And left the entire universe of the medieval world at his own back, right? Now let's extend this a little bit. So here, said, this is where he criticizes the other historical examples of exploration. So pay attention. The helmsmen, the people who were at the helms of those ships, the helmsmen of explorations have discovered how to disturb everybody's peace, how to violate the native spirits of these diverse regions, how to mingle together that which provident nature had kept separate, how by intercourse to redouble the defects and to add to the old vices the new vices of other people, with violence to propagate new follies, and to plant unheard of insanities where they did not before exist, so that he who is strongest comes to conclude that he is the wisest. So he's saying here, previous explorers like Columbus, they were horrible human beings. They disturbed everybody's peace. They violated the native spirits of those lands, right? People like Columbus led to the deaths of millions of people in North and South America. They mingled together what provident nature had kept separate. Their exploration did nothing but, as he say, create new defects and add old vices, take vices, right? The Columbus and others took alcohol and other vices to the New World, where they wreaked havoc, more or less. With violence, they propagated new follies. They planted unheard of insanities where they did not before exist. So they spoiled the New World. Every previous explorer went there, Columbus included, to essentially steal the wealth of the people living there, so that he who is the strongest comes to conclude that he is the wisest. They showed new ways, instruments, and arts for tyrannizing and murdering each other. The time will come when, in consequence of this, those men that we've discovered, or Columbus discovered in the New World, having learned at their own expense, will know how to and will be able to return to us similar and even worse fruits of such pernicious inventions. This is a bit foretelling, right? The idea is that the people in the New World will eventually, through absorbing our technology or the technology of Columbus, the rifle and so on, will turn them back against the Europeans, and then they will learn that they should not have done what they did. So that's his criticism of, and there's a little poem that puts that together as well, from Medea, an ancient source. But he tells us the Nolan, he himself, his exploration is in order to cause completely opposite effects. So his goal in exploration is not to overturn the order, not to exploit, not to corrupt, not to violently attack or murder, but rather his goal in exploration is one of freeing human beings and making human beings respect themselves and others in their difference. That's what we'll see. So he says, to the opposite effect, he has freed the human mind and the knowledge which were shut up in the strait prison of the turbulent air, right? So this is he sees this Copernican revolution and his version of it that goes beyond to the infinite universe as freeing the mind from the prison of that previously tiny universe, right? Hardly could the mind gaze at the most distant stars as if through some peepholes, and its wings were clipped so that it could not soar and pierce the veil of the clouds to see what was actually there. This is the way he sees the medieval period. It could not free itself from the chimeras, the illusions of those who have filled the whole world with infinite folly, nonsense, and vice, disguised as so much virtue, dignity, and discipline. This is criticism of the Catholic Church, of which Bruno was a member, right? By approving and confirming the misty darkness of the sophists and blockheads, they extinguished the light which made the minds of our ancient fathers divine and heroic. Therefore, human reason, so long oppressed, now and again in lucid intervals laments her condition, right? However, here comes the Nolan, right? Now behold the man, the Nolan, who has surmounted the air, penetrated the sky, wandered among the stars, passed beyond the borders of the world, who has effaced the imaginary walls of the first, eighth, ninth, 10th spheres. Those are the spheres in the Aristotelian model. And the many more you could add according to the tattlings of empty mathematicians and the blind vision of vulgar philosophers. He opened the cloisters of truth. Right? Cloisters are parts of where monks live. Right? He shows how similar or different, how greater or lesser are those bodies which we see far away, the planets, the stars, in relation to the earth which is close to us. He opens our eyes to see this deity, this God, this our Mother Earth, who feeds and nourishes us on her back after having conceived us in her womb, to which she always receives us again. And he leads us not to think that beyond her there is a material universe without souls and life, and even excrement among its corporeal substances. So in this passage, this is quite an interesting passage because this is a new idea from what we've seen so far. He says one of the effects of this exploration in one's mind of a universe that is infinite in extent, where the earth is among the stars, leads us to no longer see the earth as low, right? As that terrible place at the center of the universe where all the things furthest from the divine accumulate. Instead, we are led to have this vision of the earth as our mother, as itself almost a god, who feeds and nourishes us, right? So we are no longer something low, we become high, and so does the place in which we live. We are measured in relationship to the stars, and we are more or less like them, as we'll see, right? And it leads us, this new way of thinking, leads us to not think that outside of us, in the material universe, that there are no other souls, no other living beings, no other life. And even on the planets, far from being perfect, there is excrement, right? Aliens have toilets. There are crude things even on those planets. Suddenly, the whole medieval system of up and down, of better and worse in the universe gets obliterated. And suddenly it becomes possible to see the Earth as similar to, as good as the rest of the universe, but also in turn to see the rest of the universe and the possible planets out there as analogous to Earth, as themselves having life and many other things, right? So he continues, in this way, we know that if we were on the moon or on other stars. Now notice there, this idea. He says, in this way, we know that if we were on the moon or on the stars. Now that idea of, this is very much like the idea that Copernicus had of saying, well, look, maybe we're the ones moving and not the planets moving, right? Putting ourselves in a different position and seeing that from that other beings or from another position in the universe, we might look different, right? Maybe from the sun, it looks like the Earth is moving, whereas from our position, it looks like the sun is moving, right? Here, it's the same idea, but used in a different context by saying, if we were on the moon or the stars, we would not be in a place very different from this, right? So think from their point of view. And maybe in a worse place. Maybe what's out there is, in some cases, worse than what's here. Just as there may be other bodies quite as good and even better in themselves and in greater happiness of their inhabitants. So all these questions are now open that could never be asked before. Maybe it's a better place out there. Maybe it's a worse place. It's for us to find out. Our reason is no longer imprisoned by the fetters, the chains of the 8, 9, or 10 imaginary mobiles or movers, right? Now, another idea comes about here, which is that Bruno's understanding of Copernicus and the significance of his revolution and of this kind of extended version of the Copernican revolution that Bruno believes in. This is intimately related with his own religious outlook. Just as Copernicus's was related to his own, Bruno doesn't believe in exactly in the kind of God that was taught in the Catholic Church, one that from his point of view was too narrow, just as the medieval universe was too narrow. And so he believes that by contemplating this new vision of the universe, one gets a more appropriate conception of what God is actually like. He is not the God of those ignorant, according to his point of view, ignorant, narrow-minded, conceited priests in the church. He is a God far more glorious than that. So as he says here, so by this vision of an infinite universe, we are led to discover the infinite effect. The infinite effect is the infinite universe of the infinite cause, right? You see the parallel there. Because God is infinite, his creation is infinite. And because his creation is infinite, we can infer that God is infinite. We are led to discover the infinite effect of the infinite cause, the true and living sign of infinite vigor, infinite life. And we have the knowledge not to search for divinity removed from us. We don't have to look out to the stars for divinity. If we have it near, it's in us. It's in our own planet. We are as close to the divine as are the planets and everything else in the universe. It is within us more than we ourselves are, right? So instead of seeing man as cast away from God, right, as far away from God in the medieval world, man is as far away from God as one can get without going to hell, and must always strive upwardly towards what is better. Now, that is no longer the way Bruno sees it. We are now in the midst of the divine. In the same way, the inhabitants of other worlds, so he's already talking about what we'd call aliens, extraterrestrials, must not search for divinity in our world. So just as we don't have to look at them for God, apart from ourselves, so they don't have to look to us. They have it close to and within themselves, since the moon is no more heaven for us than we for the moon. Apply this back to the idea of Copernicus, not Copernicus, but of Columbus for a second. Essentially, what Bruno's idea here is that we should look for what is good within ourselves, and we should stay within ourselves and mind our business in a certain sense, right? And admit and allow that beings different from us have their own way of life and perhaps their own goodness and divinity within themselves. And you can see this is a kind of cosmopolitan point of view, not just for the universe. It applies for the universe, but then even more so to our own planet. That we should think of other cultures and regions of the earth as having their own center, as not being worse than us, being different but being good as well. And we don't have to go to them to find what is good, no more than they have to become like us to be good. And so he sees this new vision, and this new vision of God, the new vision of the universe, a new idea of how to relate to other things within our own universe because of this idea, as a kind of triumph, a victory, a triumph over the general ignorance which he sees in the Catholic Church. Which, of course, he's thinking of the Catholic Church, and they were at the time not doing things that were particularly noble, and they had views that there was a debate in the period about whether people in North America even had souls, because if they didn't have souls, then they wouldn't have to be converted even to Christianity. They could be treated like animals. But if they did have souls, then there was a duty to make them like the Europeans, to convert them to Christianity, and so forth. And Bruno this is just for him ignorance and arrogance and tyranny, right? That he wants to have a victory over. So that is the text. Those are the essential ideas of Bruno. There are also a few poems here. He has a couple of very nice little poems. I just read a few lines from them. And you get the idea already, I think, of how he feels, what it means to him, this Copernican revolution. He's certainly not disappointed by it. He's not made despondent or depressed. Instead, he sees this exaltation, freedom, flying into the universe, right? Being released from a prison. It's quite ironic, of course, because it was through this vision and his teaching it, preaching it, and publishing about it that led him to be actually physically imprisoned by the Catholic Church and eventually executed. So here are a few poems. Passing alone to those realms, the object erst of thine exalted thought, I would rise to infinity. Then I would pass the compass, would compass the skill of industries and arts equal to the objects. Let's analyze that a little bit. So passing alone to those realms. This is the idea of flying through the medieval universe out beyond its boundaries. He's going to pass to those realms. The object once, erst, of thine exalted thought. The object of thoughts that are high and supreme. I would rise to infinity. Then I would compass. Compass means to encompass, right? To contain. Then I would have the skill of industries and arts equal to the objects, right? If I could only rise and pass beyond the medieval universe to the true vision of things, to that infinity, then I myself would have a mind and a skill and an art equal to that infinity. So there's a kind of striving in his. There I would be reborn. There on high I would foster for thee thy fair offspring, now that at length cruel destiny hath run her whole course, and against the enterprise whereby I was wont to withdraw to thee, fly not from me, for I yearn for a nobler refuge, that I may rejoice in thee. So he's addressing the universe, but he's also addressing God at the same time, right? as something that saves him, that frees him, that he strives to know and to be like. Of the great architect, be ever gracious unto thee, but turn thou not to me unless thou art mine. Right. Second poem, escaped from the narrow, murky prison. Again, this was written before he was ever imprisoned, so it's a bit, not a coincidence, but certainly it's poignant. Escaped from the narrow, murky prison, where for so many years error held me straitly. Here I leave the chain that bound me, and the shadow of my fiercely malicious foe, who can force me no longer to the gloomy dusk of night. All right. And he goes on. He's talking about the church, of course, that it was holding him back and bound him in chains. Here, the last lines of this third poem are quite nice. Henceforth I spread my wings to space. I fear no barrier of crystal or of glass, that outer crystalline sphere of stars. I cleave, I cut through the heavens and soar to the infinite. And while I rise from my own globe to others, and penetrate ever further through the eternal field, that which others saw from afar, I leave far behind me. So this is kind of the ultimate statement of his superiority. So he is incredibly arrogant, but in a kind of in a way that kind of makes you like him and to admire him. And you can see that this idea that he sees himself as, and his vision of the universe as being so immensely greater, and of God as well, of being so immensely greater than the people around him, his contemporaries. Of course, there were others that he shared this vision with and shared these ideas, and he wasn't despising those. He didn't despise Copernicus or others. He's despising the people who are trying to keep him within their confines and to chain him down. And what they see as far as the ultimate end of the universe, he sees at his back. Okay. So that's the end of the lecture.